Good evening, everybody. Tokyo Drew 85 here, and tonight I'm going to do a list of my top 10 favorite Resident Evil games. Now, these are games in this series that even now I always come back to and play over and over again. In the number 10 spot, we have the first Resident Evil. Now, this is the game that set the standard for survival horror. The 2D backgrounds with the 3D sprites was very revolutionary at the time, and the whole storytelling with the voice acting and the cutscenes was very cinematic. Again, this was the first game in the series, and there was nothing like it at the time. The exploration and the zombies, it just had a great backdrop. And then as far as the survival horror aspects go, you were just in a mansion, again, which was a great setting. You had limited ammo and you were dealing with a lot of these bioweapons, as well as a complex story unfolding in front of you, almost like a movie. It had elements of betrayal and action in it, and again, for its time, it was just way ahead of its time and set the bar real high for other survival horror games in the series. In the number 9 spot, we have Resident Evil 4. I know with most people, it's probably much higher on the list, but for me, I did enjoy it. It was okay. I don't like it as much as everybody else does, but the game does a lot of things right. Like, it's the first game to radically change the formula. It had a over-the-shoulder view to aim at zombies and take out different parts of them. It had that European setting background where it took place in the town, and you had the new virus, the Las Plagas. They were more dangerous. They could coordinate. They could corner you. So the enemies were more complex. And the storytelling was good there too. I didn't like it as much as the others, but the game itself cannot be undersold. It completely redid the series and actually pointed it in a different direction for the next couple of games, with a lot of its action set pieces and overall just aesthetic that carried on for the next couple of games. In the number 8 spot, we have Resident Evil Village. Now, this game is one of the newer games on my list, not the newest games at the time of this video, but this is by far my favorite new Resident Evil game. Like, I love how it goes back to the first person style that Resident Evil 7 started, and the whole aspect of the village was great because, again, that RE engine delivers fantastic graphics, lighting, and sound, and it felt like really like an open-ended Resident Evil. Like, you were able to explore the village and go to each area. You know, you have Lady Dimitrescu's castle, and you have Heisenberg's lab. Everything just looks and sounds great, and again, because of that whole village aesthetic, you really were exploring. It just felt like a world. It almost just felt like a Zelda game, but it was like Resident Evil. You were free to explore this whole survival horror world, and that's one thing I really liked about the game as well. In the number 7 spot, we have Resident Evil 3. Not the remake, the original Resident Evil 3. Again, when it came out at the time, it was just leaps and bounds over the first 2 games that came before it. Not as many characters, but the whole set piece of taking place in the city during the outbreak was an awesome choice, because you were pretty much there when you saw the zombies break out and infect the entire city. And the game had a lot of complex mechanics. In addition to obviously Nemesis chasing you around, the game had multiple endings depending on what decisions you made at certain points of the game, which also affected what characters you'd run into and at what times. And with that complex system in place, the game has, I think, at least like over 10 endings. So the game's got a ton of replay value, it's got a great graphics and story, and it's got the Nemesis, again, a very iconic Resident Evil boss that pretty much stalks you throughout the whole city, pops out randomly, always keeps you on your toes, because you never know when he's gonna come out. And then you learn the fate, again, of Raccoon City, not to get too much into spoilers. But overall, the game was just an awesome package. In the number 6 spot, right behind it, we have the original Resident Evil 2. And again, I remember renting this game from the video game store, and I remember getting into the police station and getting to that first hallway, and the zombie's arms just grabbing me through the windows was pretty jarring. There's so many times where I would just turn the game off because I was like so scared to play it. But the game is phenomenal. It does everything the first game does, but just 10 times better. I mean, it doesn't control any better, but again, you're in the setting of the police station. It's just a great setting, had a very creepy backdrop. It added a lot of new enemy types like the Lickers, and William Birkin as the boss, again, who was just, you fight many forms of him, and it was just a great experience all around. It was, I feel like the game had a lot more polish too than the first game. It was a little more cohesive. The combat was about the same, but something about the game in general just played better, flowed better. The story was definitely better, and also these sub-characters too were better, with Sherry Birkin and Ada Wong. And also too, the game had 2 scenarios, one with Claire and one with Leon. And the cool thing about that was, depending on which character you did first, you would do the other scenario as the opposite character. So you could see during, like, let's say during Leon's campaign, you could see what Claire was doing and vice versa. It had a ton of replay value. And also the game has a lot of unlockable modes that you can get as well from playing all these different scenarios. So the game had also a ton of content too. And again, it's a fantastic game all around. In the number 5 spot, we have Resident Evil Revelations. Now, again, one of the newer games on my list, and I really appreciate it because right before Resident Evil 7 came out, this series was kind of stuck in that action focus, especially coming after Resident Evil 6. And Resident Evil Revelations kind of brought it back to its roots a bit. Like the whole idea of the game taking place on the ship, I thought was a very good idea. Considering it's like an isolated environment, you have a whole new story, but a lot of familiar faces. You have Jill, you have Chris, and some other new characters too. The story I felt in the game was very good. Had a very good backstory to it. Had still some action set pieces, but again, it had a lot of the game. You were just crawling around the ship, and it felt like a lot more like a classic Resident Evil as far as like taking out enemies and puzzle solving. It really did feel like before Resident Evil 7 came out, it just went back to its roots. And overall, it is a game I do enjoy playing now. In the number 4 spot, I mentioned it already a couple of times, is Resident Evil 7. Resident Evil 7 was such a refreshing game to play after I feel like the series had a bit of a lull, especially during 5 and 6, where, you know, I feel like it went away from survival horror and started dipping its toes into like a more action focus. But going to the first person perspective I thought was a great idea. Like the Baker residence was a very creepy environment, and being in the first person perspective made everything just much creepier, because again, it puts you kind of in those characters' shoes. And watching the different tapes and you learn the fates of each character, I thought was just a great idea. It's like a lot of world building in the game. It gets you involved with all the characters, and the game had a great story too. That Resident Evil engine, again, that engine is phenomenal. Graphics, lighting, sound. The game is just the whole package. And it's a game I'm playing through now again because I haven't played it in a while, and it's just overall a very enjoyable experience. Number 3 is the Resident Evil 2 remake. Now this I feel like was one of the best remakes I've played of any game. Like, this remake was just done right. Again, it brings the series back with the Resident Evil engine that they used in 7. They included everything in the original Resident Evil 2 and just expanded on it. They just made everything better. They added new areas a little bit. They changed the floor plan of a couple of areas, but they also added some more set pieces in there too, and they made like an already great game much better. As opposed to the Resident Evil 3 remake, which is not on my list, that cut a bunch of content out, which is why it's not included on the list. But the Resident Evil 2 remake is how you do a remake. It still retains all the great things we loved about the first game, the graphics, the sound, the characters, the storytelling, and just makes everything look better with that nice Resident Evil engine coat, and the game it plays great, it looks great, and I love playing it. It is just a fantastic game to play. In the number 2 spot is Resident Evil HD. Now, just a little background on this game. This is actually the GameCube game, just an HD version of the GameCube game, because the GameCube game itself is a remake of the first Resident Evil. It is just a game I just play over and over again. Essentially, it's the first Resident Evil. They just added a whole bunch of content in that they couldn't do in the original PlayStation release. It's just an HD version of that. And again, it's just Resident Evil 1, but with so much more expanded content with new areas. In this version of the game, from the original PS version, they added a whole new kind of a boss character that lurks around the house that kind of stalks you. It still has all the original characters. The voice acting's better, not much better, but it's a little better. And again, the HD visuals in that game hold up pretty well to this day. Like, I have the PS4 version of Resident Evil HD, and it still holds up. And it has multiple options. A lot of people don't like the tank controls, but I feel like overall the game it still holds up today. It plays well, it looks great, and it's just, again, it's a great testament to the survival horror series. And then the number 1 spot, we have Code Veronica. I know it's gonna upset a lot of people, but like, I have so much nostalgia for this game. I remember first playing it on the Dreamcast when it first came out. My friend's brother bought it at launch brand new, and we would sneak into his room and play it all the time. And this game just blew my mind when it first came out, because this is the first Resident Evil to be fully 3D without having any pre-rendered backgrounds from the first original PlayStation games. And I remember at the time when it came out, people were upset that there wasn't a PlayStation version. And again, this was before PS2 came out, because that did get the Code Veronica X treatment, but before that, people were complaining that there was no PS1 version of it. But this game overall is just great. It had like a very, very dark story involving this elite rich family, and Claire gets captured trying to look for Chris after Chris disappears after the first game, and it's just great. It's got a lot of like creepy areas in the game too, like it's got a medic hospital and a torture chamber, and then it's got this like complex backstory with the Ashfords, and it's just great. It's got great characters, it's got a great overarching story, and you get to see some of your favorite characters, especially Chris, you know, team back up again, and you have Wesker come back too again, which, you know, you haven't seen him since the first game, and seeing him come back with his new abilities just like tied the whole game together. Like, it had an amazing amount of enemy types too as well. There's all different kinds of enemies, between the zombie dogs, the bender snatches, the albinoids. The game just had a huge variety of enemies, and it had a great end game with the final boss, especially Alexia. Alexia was a pretty good villain and a great last boss. So anyway, guys, that wraps up my top 10 list of Resident Evil games, and I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Like and subscribe, and have a good night. Thank you.